Today on CJ Off-Road, we're going to show you how to install a set of flat fenders on our 2016 Jeep Wrangler. Flat fenders can give your Jeep increased tire clearance as well as a custom look. So today we've got these rugged ridge black textured Hurricane Fender Flares fitting your 2007 through 2018 Jeep Wrangler. These Hurricane fenders are designed to resemble the original Willys Jeep and incorporate modern features. Fender Flares are sold as a set of 4 and will completely change the look of your Jeep. They are constructed of a durable black TPE plastic, which is resistant to fading. Included also is a set of both stainless steel and black mounting hardware to perfectly match your Jeep. Now our Jeep could really use the added clearance, so let's get started with the install. Tools needed for this installation: a 3/8" ratchet, a 10mm socket, a 13mm socket, 8mm Allen key, 7mm box wrench, 10mm box wrench, 13mm box wrench, Phillips head screwdriver, trim removal tool, wire cutters, wire strippers, a marker, cutters, a drill, 11/32 drill bit, and safety glasses. We're ready to install the Hurricane fenders, but before we do that, we have to remove the factory set. Now we're going to start by removing this little light right here for the marker light, and also there's a 10mm bolt right underneath. To remove this light, pull out the inner liner a little bit and twist the bulb clockwise and pull it towards you, and just let that hang for later. To remove the fender liner, remove these 4 push pins that go along the top here, as well as a 10mm bolt towards the back. And remove the last 10mm bolt. Make sure you save all the push pins and this bolt. You'll be reinstalling them later. With the push pins removed and that 10mm bolt, you can pull the liner down and access the inner subframe bolts. Now with the liner out of the way, we can start with the front 10mm bolt, work our way back through. There's 5 in total. Now that we've got the inner fender structure completely unbolted, we can remove, there's a little tree up here that actually divides this wire, so we'll pull that down. And just let this hang freely for now. So we've got the inner fender liner removed, we've got the inner fender structure removed. You're going to grab the outside fender firmly and pull it towards you. It'll break some of the clips on the inside, but it doesn't matter, you're not going to be using them again, so let's get started. So we ripped the fender flare off. We've got a couple more of these clips laying around. We'll just pull them off with a clip removal tool. Now in order to make sure that you have marker lights on the fender flares, you do need to extend the factory connections here. We're going to unplug it from this terminal here and extend the pieces. So we've got the tape removed from the split loom here, exposing the 2 wires underneath. The kit comes with 2 female butt connectors as well as some standard butt connectors. They want you to remove this connection here and replace it with butt connectors and go into this black piece. Now we're going to do it a little bit differently, that way we can maintain the factory look and functionality. We're going to use 2 butt connectors and just extend it with some wiring. Now we're going to give ourselves about 2 inches from this end to right about here, make our cut and extend the wiring. Now for the Hurricane fender flares, you actually do have to route your wiring a little bit different than the factory location. It's actually going to come up towards here and pop up through. Now in our case, since we are using the factory connectors, I'm only going to extend this side that mounts onto the main connection. That way I can run it up through here and then connect it once it's through. So we didn't make this connection yet because we're going to fish it through underneath the bracket we're going to install now. We're going to install the provided bracket and put a washer and nut underneath. We're only going to loosely tighten this down. Once we get all the hardware installed, we'll tighten it down to its final position. We're going to run this wire up behind the bracket here and then connect it back into the factory connections. We're going to pull as much slack out of the wiring as we can and use the provided zip tie to secure it into place. We can now loosely install the Hurricane Fender Flare. You're going to need 2 nuts and bolts to loosely tighten it up, that way it stays in place. The reason we mock this Fender Flare up is so we can mark this last hole in the back. There isn't a hole in the factory body, so we're going to mark it with a Sharpie and drill it out to 11/32 once we get the fender off. Once you get the fender flare off, we can center punch this hole and drill it out to 11/32. So now we've got the fender flare liners off of the actual fender. We're going to mock it back up and trim it so it'll work with the Hurricane fenders. Okay, so we've got this mocked up. You're going to want to make a mark with a paint marker. We have a silver Sharpie, and then you're going to cut off the excess since this will be covered by the new Hurricane Fender Flare. We're going to repeat the same steps for the back, mark it, and then cut it. We've got the fender liner trimmed up. Now we can go ahead and install the Hurricane flares. We've got the flare on. We're going to start installing the hardware. Now there are some differences. This does come with 45mm washers as well as the 16mm washers. The 45mm are the larger ones, and you'll use those in certain areas. We're going to start from the front and work our way back. The first one does use one of the smaller washers. And this next bolt we'll actually use one of the larger washers for. Now we're going to use the larger washers and nuts for the next 3 bolts here. These last 3 bolts get the 16mm washer on the back of them. We're going to go back through and tighten all of these down before we install the fender liner. With the Hurricane Flare installed, we can now put the fender liner back in. We can reinstall this using the factory hardware. Start with the farthest most rear without any washer, just use the factory nut. And to reinstall the factory fender liner, you're going to use the factory provided bolts with the Rugged Ridge provided 45mm washers. And we're going to put one of the factory bolts into this last hole up front. Now we're going to tighten up this bolt that we installed earlier, making sure that our 2 outward holes line up with the outside of the fender. And now that we've got everything tightened up underneath, we can go on to the marker light. Rugged Ridge does provide the marker light, which we're going to install on the side here. I'm going to place this marker light inside the housing and then tighten it all up. Now, as I mentioned before, this does come with both stainless steel and black hardware. We're going to go with the stainless steel to match some of the accents on our Jeep. And all you need to do is place these into these little holes right here and put a nut on the backside and tighten it up. We're going to get the rest of the hardware installed, repeat the same process on the other side, and we can get moving on to the rear. So we made it to the back of the Jeep. We're going to start by removing this factory flare. Before we do so, we're going to remove the 6 push pins that hold in the liner. With all of the push pins removed, we can now pull the factory fender off. And we can remove any of these leftover clips. Now, just like we did it in the fronts, we're going to reinstall the liners and mark them to be trimmed. And now we can pull this back off and trim it up. Our rear fender liner is completely trimmed up. We can now go ahead and install the rear Hurricane fender. Now, the rear installation is a little bit different than the front. You'll be using the provided push pins for a lot of the holes in the back. You'll also be using 2 nuts for these top 2 points up here. We're going to put the flare up to place and start at the front with some push pins. We're going to put the 2 bolts into these top 2 holes. And we'll go ahead and tighten them up. The last 4 push pins need to be installed into the rear. We're going to now reinstall our trimmed fender liner behind the Hurricane flare. Then put the 4 push pins into the existing holes. Just like in the front, we're going to install our stainless steel hardware into these 2 holes. So now that these are tightened up, we're going to repeat the process on the other side of the Jeep, and your installation is complete. We just finished the install of these Rugged Ridge Hurricane Fender Flares on our JK. They really transformed the look and gave us a ton more tire clearance. Install was super simple, took about an hour and a half. Now you can find these Fender Flares and many other great parts at cjponyparts.com, and I'll see you out on the trail.